Thank you so much for having me today. And this is my first time in Montreal, so it's really great to see so many people from different background and presenting here. And the diversity of this conference is what people usually expect to see in Canada. But as a Chinese immigrant, I and many of my friends have encountered a lot of racist incidents in Canada. And before I start on my topic, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Sebastian, and I moved to Canada when I was 17. For the first 7 years of my life in Canada, I had no direct contact with any racist incident, but maybe I was oblivious enough not to notice anything. Then I had my first close contact in Ottawa, but that wasn't the only time, and I wasn't the only one encountering. Some of the participants from this research shared their racist encounter during the pandemic. This was a time when international students were physically isolated and overwhelmed by the anti-Asian assaults all over the internet. When people tried to escape from the reality and log into an online game, they would see other users leaving Chinese virus comments, or their teammates are trying to kill them to ruin their game. For Chinese international students who lived in Canada, the pandemic was made of two viruses, the COVID-19 virus and the virus of anti-Chinese hate. The epidemic may have become less of a threat nowadays, but the virus of hate continues. And these experiences with racists inspired me to research the digital media habits and anti-racist strategies of Chinese international students in Canada. I'm interested in learning how digital media shapes the way Chinese students understand their positionality in Canada and how they accept their racial identity, how they cope with the continuing racism targeting Chinese communities. In this presentation, I will briefly discuss my methodology along with existing knowledge that inspired this research. Then I plan to share some of the key findings that challenged the way we think about Chinese students, including how they understood racism before moving to Canada, as well as the different ways they learn and resist racism. In 2023, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 20 Chinese international students at York University. I used the snowball sampling method to recruit the participants. This means that in addition to sending the recruitment poster to faculty members, Chinese student associations, and international student offices on campus, I also asked participants to share the poster on their social media accounts. Based on existing studies, scholars believe that Chinese people live in a mostly monocultural society, so they are used to, they're usually not treated as minorities in China, and they have very limited experiences dealing with racism. Given the increasing stress between China and the US, some suggest that the social issues in the West are not topics that the Chinese education system would emphasize on. Consequently, Chinese international students are confused when they face racism. Under this condition, some scholars believe that Chinese international students commonly choose to avoid confrontations. They would ignore linguistic assaults and avoid potential dangers. Moreover, some scholars use sophisticated egoism to describe Chinese international students. They believe that Chinese students are not passionate about politics, and they're trained to prioritize their individual gains rather than thinking of their contribution to society. According to their research, some Chinese students think that anti-racist protests can only be emotional outlets rather than leading to pragmatic changes and impact. Some of the findings of this research agree with the existing studies. Let's start with the concept of race in China. Based on my conversation with participants, I think racism is not new to them, but they had a very limited understanding of it. Some participants recall that they learned about racism in history class when they were in China. One participant said that history is his favorite subject, so he learned a lot from reading history books. He stressed that he studied extensively on the history of the Second World War and traced the origin of racism to the discrimination against the Jewish community in Europe. However, a common theme I observed from my participants is that their definition of racism are mostly about anti-Black racism or historical events such as World War II. It means that these participants had a somewhat limited perception of the concept of race. Some participants admit that after they arrived in Canada, they experienced racism against Chinese for the first time. This changed their perspective from a bystander to victims of racial discrimination for the first time. Hence, most participants in this study still needed to learn about racism after they arrived in Canada. The second part of this research confirms one of my hypotheses that digital media is crucial to their understanding and resistance to racism, but it also pinpoints some limitations of digital media. Social media provided participants with news updates on racism and influencers' personal experiences, experiencing and dealing with racism. It also introduced some participants to inclusive media content, which showcases the ideal diversified society. One participant specifically shared that she enjoyed watching video on YouTube. Not only did she learn how people from other communities live, but she also admired those content creators' talents in music, acting, painting, and so on. Hence, participants learned to appreciate cultural diversity and respect other cultures. However, the strategies influencers provided to cope with racism might not be useful to participants. When participants face racism in reality, they find it hard to think of any strategies and apply them. While people learn about racism and racial diversity on the internet, some complain about the digital media due to the exposure to racism content. Several participants believe that online posts can be extremely racist compared to daily conversation. Participant 15 suggests that the internet magnifies the hatred between countries due to the need for clickbait. The internet also makes it safer for people to leave nasty comments they would hide in real life. Consequently, a few participants tried to avoid reading news during the pandemic so they would feel less stressed and less depressed. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, participants faced verbal insult when they played a video game with strangers. What makes it worse is that when someone uses the N-word, they would be banned from the game. But if someone uses any sort of slur targeting the Chinese, they're not really punished. Incidents like this happened to all 4 of the video game players I interviewed. When it comes to coping strategies against racism, the findings partially agree with the passive responses of Chinese students. Many participants suggest they would ignore racist attack in public because they don't feel safe enough in the local environment. Considering the limited political power and voice of the Chinese, the possible gun violence in Canada, and the lack of social connections to support them, the cost for each student to respond to racism, including the verbal insult, is too high. So they choose to ignore racist comment and focus on their own life. However, many participants also show a social responsibility and a willingness to challenge racism in less confrontational ways. In contrast to existing research, most participants suggest that they would respond to racist or speak up when they are in a more safe environment. For example, one participant found a course reading that has the phrase Wuhan virus, and they emailed the professor directly to complain about it. What's more, participants believe that racist survivors should not only report an encounter, but also use every resource available to them. Otherwise, they may not get any results. Other participants also suggest that Chinese people will only be respected when we show our strengths rather than tolerate the bullying. Instead of focusing solely on their personal benefits, many participants are considering the collective good. Some participants are inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement and suggest that the Chinese students should learn from this movement and fight racism in solidarity. Specifically, participant 5 actively fight racism online. During the pandemic, participant 5 would search for racist comments on the internet and call her friends to fight them together. She uses the internet as a tool to express her feelings and a way to reinforce a bond between her and her country. Another way to make use of digital media is to form an online community of support. A few participants expressed how comforting it was to see supportive messages online, and they suggested that a racist survivor can feel much better when they see support and when they see anti-racist comments on the internet. In this presentation, I highlighted two main subjects: the racial identity of Chinese international students and their coping strategies for anti-Asian racism. This research suggests that most participants had a basic understanding of racism, but they rarely thought about their racial position because they were used to being a racial majority in China. In terms of anti-racism strategies, digital media has played three key functions. It educates Chinese international students about racism, it provides a supportive online network, and it helps students to express their identity and follow reports through digital tools. Last but not least, the systemic bias that neglects Chinese racist slurs could be worth further research. This also suggests that media companies should implement modifications that offer their users a more impartial and equitable environment. Similarly, many participants worry about the lack of systemic support and the inadequate political power of the Chinese. From an institutional perspective, universities should reach out to their international students more often to understand what they need and how they can provide better services to students. That will be the end of my presentation today. Thank you so much.
All right.